literally almost thrown out of bed. My first reaction was because of being a baby of the Cold War and the fact that our generation grew up with duck and cover, and there was a lot of diving under school desks or standing in door frames. And my first reaction was, especially because there were explosions outside my bedroom window, the Russians have finally come. We're finally getting bombed, and this is the start of a war. Now, that probably lasted for all of maybe, I don't know how long. All I know is that I had very heavy oak furniture in my bedroom, and it was all very Western variety, and it all walked to the middle of the bedroom. But there was a piece that was blocking the door. So the only way I could get out was I just mustered up as much strength as I had and moved that piece out and raced into the living room, which was a long living room with wagon wheel chandeliers that basically you couldn't move them otherwise. But these things were going back and forth and scraping the asbestos off the ceiling. And it was at that point that I dove under. And meanwhile, the shaking is still going on. The shaking never stopped. It didn't stop until I dove under the dining room table, and my father opened up the bedroom to my stepmother in his room and said, "Get under the table now." And there was five of us, five siblings and two adults in the house at the time. So it was a big panic. But that was the first minute and a half of life, and that was when I figured out, holy shit, this is not the bombs, this is a quake. What happened was there were my two little sisters, younger sisters, were in another bedroom, and somehow or other, I think my father swept the house, being the good Marine that he is, to find out where the kids were. My two brothers were in a back bedroom that lined the pool, and the water in the pool just went tsunami style straight into their room. So I think the first thing he did, and one of my brothers was handicapped, so the first thing I think my father did was sweep the house and get the kids out, however he did. I just remember jumping through the dining room windows. They were very long windows, vertically, and you could open them up and then jump out. And at that point, there was a move under one of the olive trees, and we ended up there for the next few days. Now, the great thing about it was my father being the environmentalist and the camper, we had tons of camping gear. So with that, we had bought all this food, and it was called Sam Andy food. So we had cartons of this prefab food that we ended up eating for the next few days and using the water, what was left in the pool, for sanitary purposes and for just water, and so did the neighborhood, because we were the only pool in the neighborhood. So we lived on that front lawn for the next 3 or 4 days until the rains came. What I do remember was that night, because there was a lot of aftershocks. There must have been hundreds of aftershocks. And that night there was an eclipse. I think it was a lunar eclipse. And that's what the story I remember from the experts was that the gravitational pull possibly from that lunar eclipse or the startup could have pulled into the earth in such a way that it jolted this particular fault. Now, that was the story that I heard at the time. I don't know if there's total truth to that. But I remember laying out there that night with the ground constantly rolling right on top of, right under me, and the moon going into this eclipse. It was a very life-altering, spooky, strange world at that point. We were briefly involved with the LDS group in 1969, and then I got out of it in probably late 70, and as did my dad and then another few members. But still, what we got out of that, obviously, was the food preparation and the fact that we were already on the ground campers. We were not into we didn't even have tents. Dad would take us out with just sleeping bags on the ground. So we were kind of prepped for it in that way. The interesting thing about that, what happened with the hospitals, especially the new one that they had built, was that the day before that, my father had taken me up there for my first job interview. And I was interviewed in the cafeteria in the wing that fell down.
Really?
So it had a very haunting feeling for me when that hospital just was, that one wing fell and now it was leveled, was that the day before we had just gone there and my application was there for my first job. Oh, it was horrifying. It was horrifying that it was that close. And it was horrifying to know that there was a reality that set in where you didn't know how many of your friends were okay, because the other part of this was, of course, there was no phone communication. That had all been broken apart. So the infrastructure in Sylmar had fallen at the same time. And my memory was we didn't have phones for the next 3 months. And what we had was they put a phone booth up on the corner. And that's where I ended up meeting a lot of other people that I didn't know in school, because we all congregated around that phone booth. The other thing is that there was, when we went indoors 3 days later, 4 days later, remember it was a Friday for some reason, the rains came, and because of all the cracks in the house, all the water from the rain seeped into the house. So then we're dealing with this murky, almost underwater existence where the bedroom that my bedroom in the front I couldn't sleep in there. So we were in another bedroom and all the beds were moved to the center of the room because the walls were weeping water, and that led to mold, which is something in those days nobody really checked for. So obviously, I mean, I think there's a lot of, now we look back and I think there's a lot of probably underlying health issues that we were not even aware of.
Do you want to talk about those? You don't have to if you don't want to.
Yeah, no, I definitely feel, even though it's been almost 50 years, but the underlying health issues that hit our respiratory system can sometimes take decades to manifest, depending on what they are. And the fact that there could have been mold in that house, definitely asbestos. We lived in an old house that was built in the 30s that was moved from Chatsworth to Sylmar, and we bought it in 65. So there were a lot of questionable issues with the environment. Not only that, but olive trees in general are extremely asthmatic and allergenic. I mean, they have a high degree of people developing asthma and allergens from the olive trees. So being surrounded by them, and plus all the dirt, the dust, the construction that happened after the quake, the fact that we couldn't leave Sylmar, you couldn't get in, you couldn't get out.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I remember. So there was a lot of partying going on, because we weren't in school either, because the school was pretty mangled. So with that in mind, I think that definitely in the case of both my brother and I, that these underlying issues in the respiratory system finally manifested themselves and have come along. Listen, the interstitial lung disease that I have, my brother died of the same one 5 years ago. And I really think that it was related to the earthquake.
Really?
Yes. And the reason why is because the doctor who did the biopsy on my lungs, he told me that after the 1994 earthquake, that there was an uptick of this particular lung disease that happened because of all the asbestos, the dirt, the construction, and the fact that we lived on a half acre loaded with horses, chickens, dogs, the whole 9 yards, at the end of a dirt street on Felipe. And every time those Santa Anas would blow, the wind would just blow all the dirt straight into the house. What I learned, it took me, I think, probably like most of us, some time to process the actual event. I think that in the moment of the event and the ensuing months, that we were locked up in either graduating from high school, meeting. Listen, I met at what we called earthquake parties, which when you weren't going to school, everybody would have these parties at their house. And I met a young man there that ended up to be my boyfriend for the next 3 years until I moved to Northern California to go to college. And I'm still very close with his family and in touch with his family. So there was more at the time of just, we got through this. And once we got school back, then we can get through this, graduate, and go off into our life. I do not know how many people stayed in Sylmar. I was 2 weeks out of 18, I'm done. I'm gone. So I think that what the quake did was it brought on some sense of independence because of being in that survival mode. I wasn't fearful at all. I've never been fearful of earthquakes since. I've gone through a number of them, particular to the 94 one here, but also a few marginally big ones up in the Bay Area. And there's a funny sense of almost anticipating before it hits. It's as though, because there was a particular sound that the quake made when it rumbled. And you can't describe it, but it's very descriptive when it happens. And it's almost like before it even happens, I'm anticipating because I can hear it. There's like a sixth sense, I think, that dove in somewhere. So in 94, my daughter was a year and a half, and she was in the crib next to me. And when that started shaking my husband at the time in my place in West Hollywood, he had just been home for 15 minutes from work. He was on a night shift before that quake hit. And I just jumped immediately up, grabbed the baby, jumped back into bed, pulled the covers over my head, and this is safe. And even now, when I feel them coming, I know what to do, as opposed to that moment in time at 6:02, where you almost know what to do because you've been taught what to do for years before that with the drills. But again, I really thought that those generators were bombs. So, it's almost like here we are also prepped for that in a way. I think that we are made to be resilient. I mean, that's what I've learned. If you pursue that resiliency. If you live in fear, that's a whole different thing. That puts down an automatic wall to being able to move forward. Listen, in the moment that these things happen, yes, there is fear. But I look at it as like survival fear. I look at it like, okay, this fear is here because it means I have to pay attention and move forward. So I think that with our situation now and being quarantined, because we were quarantined in 1971. We did go through a quarantine. And it was also, if I remember, because the water was questionable. There were other kinds of considerations. Malaria, for instance, was that going to hit? So we were quarantined. But there was a certain sense, again, of that survival and being in a group dynamic and being in a community that actually, I remember that community coming together, not splitting apart, even the lowriders and the surfers. So there was a coming together point. And I think that with our COVID situation right now, it's important for us as parents and as community to impart that to our children. This is not going to go on forever. It's what we have to do right now. We will get through this. And I'm not Pollyanna-ish about this at all. This is just based on that experience, I really think, in 1971. Let me just add one last thing. There was a component of my family that was kind of sad at the time. My mother had kind of disappeared out of our life for about 3 years. And it was through that earthquake that when they set up I remember a trailer at the elementary school where you could actually phone out. You could phone to your relatives. And I remember phoning my aunt up in Northern California and saying, "Where's my mother?" One of the first things I actually thought about family was, "Oh my gosh, we haven't spoken to mom. We've got to try and find her." And through that, my brother, my sister and I reconnected with our mother, and then from that point on, began to pick up a relationship with her. So I think that was one of the silver linings out of that whole event that happened. And the other not silver lining was the breakup of the marriage between my father and his second wife, but I think that was doomed to begin with anyway. And the earthquake was just one more little nail on that coffin, and that was fine by all of us. But the community was, people can laugh about Sylmar, they can say what they want, but there was definitely that sense of community and sharing and getting to know people that you didn't even know before, especially because of the company that I kept at high school then, which were pretty radical. Mostly, we were all anti-war. We were getting into the stage where protesting was a norm. Even protesting on our campus became a norm. But there were also these underlying issues between the African American and the Latino community that were also, I think, a part of this overall social situation that was happening. So the police presence brought in its own tonality that was, I think, very disruptive, and people had a natural fear of this. So when you saw the black and whites driving around, it was another kind of duck and cover, because there were some curfews that happened. And I remember that the looting primarily actually happened just around the corner from here in the shopping center. There was a lot of looting that went on. So and we were not that far away from there. So it was difficult with teenagers. How do you keep teenagers locked up? It was difficult. So I think that my memory of that part, and I haven't really given a whole lot of thought, but looking at what's going on today and then linking it to the same feeling then of this fear of the patrols, I think, there's a lot of validity there. What he was concerned about was the drug issues, okay, because Sylmar became kind of its own hotbed of a lot of, and it wasn't only just pot, it wasn't just, marijuana, it was a whole host of other drugs. What I remember is that there was Seconal involved, there were all these barbiturates that were going around. It wasn't sort of the surfer side of drugs, it was the lowrider side of drugs, as I would say. Which even, there was a heroin link, there was a lot of that going on, especially around the park. So he actually put together a whole community action committee that would patrol the park and be the citizens patrol, and then report anything back to the Foothill Division that looked suspicious. Now this was very difficult for for we teenagers, because there was a certain amount of intake on our end, especially with pot. So here you've got your dad on the narc squad, and that's what we called it, the narc squad. And he ran into quite a bit of trouble that could have been very dangerous for he and for the rest of the family, with not the police, but of course with the lowrider community, with the car club community. There was one car club, I'll never forget it, the Valley Saviors, and they had a little thing on the back of their car, a nice little plaque, but they were pretty vicious. They could be pretty vicious, and they were at one point had kind of a hit out on him.